The first thing people remembered about Thomas Wren was not his face or his soft voice, or even the way he walked with a slight lean, as if he were always stepping out of a dream. What they remembered was the smell, something faint, sweet, and almost floral, like old roses crushed into the pages of a forgotten book. It clung to him the way dust clings to shelves in an unused study. To most people in Victorian-era Georgia and London, that smell meant laudanum, the so-called miracle medicine that blurred pain and softened the world. To Thomas, it meant survival. Or at least, that was the story he told himself on the nights when the quiet felt too loud. He was not born for a life of shadows. No one is. He grew up outside Savannah, surrounded by fields that glowed gold at sunset, with a mother who sang while she worked, and a father who believed a man should stand straight and face the world without flinching. Thomas tried. He really did. But the world does not soften just because someone hopes it will. And when a logging accident left him with a torn shoulder and the kind of pain that made breathing feel like a test, a doctor placed a small dark bottle in his palm and promised relief. Only a little each day, the doctor said, just until you can sleep again. The first drop felt like warmth. The fifth felt like permission to forget. By the end of the first month, he no longer remembered what the world sounded like without that syrupy, quiet humming in his ears. Victorian Georgia was full of people who whispered behind porches and storefronts, but they never looked too closely at what others were hiding. That was one thing Thomas depended on. The other was the way the laudanum blurred the edges of his thoughts. He told himself he could stop at any time. He could return the bottle to the cabinet, walk away, face the days like everyone else. But the bottle was always beside him, at meals, at work, in church. His hands reached for it the way some people reach for prayer. By the time he left for London, chasing a rumor of work at a shipping office near Whitechapel, the habit had settled deep into him. People on the ship noticed he slept too much and ate too little, but no one asked. They were all running from something: poverty, heartache, bad decisions, so it seemed rude to pry. Besides, he kept to himself, leaning over the railing at dusk as if the sea might offer answers. London hit him like a cold breath. The streets felt louder, narrower, and older, as though the whole city had learned long ago to live with secrets and simply expected newcomers to do the same. Thomas found a small room above a bakery, one with thin walls and a window that rattled on windy nights. He took work wherever he could, moving crates, copying ledgers, sweeping out storerooms. Anything that kept people from looking too closely at him. What surprised him most was that the laudanum did not make him invisible. It made him noticeable in a quiet, unsettling way. The apothecary on Bishopsgate noticed. Mrs. Harrow, who ran the bakery below his room, noticed. Even the children who swept the alleys around Whitechapel seemed to sense the fragile tremor beneath his calm. But there was one person who noticed more than anyone else. Her name was Clara Howell, a seamstress who lived 2 doors down. She was quick-eyed and patient, the sort of person who could thread a needle in dim candlelight and still sense when a neighbor was stumbling under the weight of something heavy. She met Thomas on a rain-soaked morning when he dropped a parcel outside her building. She handed it back with a small smile, but her gaze lingered just a moment too long. Not in judgment, not in pity, in recognition. Laudanum addiction was not rare in Victorian-era London. It touched the wealthy, the working class, mothers, dock workers, clerks, and lonely travelers who carried old wounds across oceans. Clara had seen it before. Family members, customers, people whose hands shook not from hunger or cold, but from a need they could not name out loud. Still, she said nothing that morning, and Thomas, sensing she knew more than she let on, avoided her for days. He tried to focus on work, on the endless movement of crates, and the small pay at the end of the week. But the bottle stayed close. He told himself it kept him steady. He told himself it helped him sleep. He told himself anything that kept the truth from feeling too sharp. Then the nights in London began to change. It started with faint sounds from the hallway near his room, footsteps when no one should be awake, a door creaking softly in the dark, the murmur of voices too low to make out. Thomas thought it was the laudanum at first, messing with his senses. He tried taking less, then more, but the noises stayed. And soon, He was sure he was not imagining them. One night, long after the bakery ovens had gone cold, he heard someone pause outside his door. The floorboard creaked under a slow, deliberate weight. Not a neighbor hurrying by, not someone stumbling half asleep, someone intentionally standing there. Thomas sat up, heart pounding in a way laudanum could not soften. The smell of dough and smoke drifted up from downstairs, mixing with the sweet, medicated scent rising from his own hands. He waited, listening so hard it hurt. The hallway stayed silent for nearly a minute. Then the footsteps moved on. But the next morning, when he looked at the dust near his doorframe, he saw something that made his throat tighten. A faint impression of a heel. Not large, not heavy, but recent. Claire knocked on his door just before noon, asking to borrow a kettle. Her voice was steady, but her eyes kept drifting to his trembling hands. She glanced at the hallway, then back at him, as if weighing whether to speak. Finally, she said quietly, "You should be careful at night. Someone's been watching the rooms." Thomas felt the world tilt a little. He wanted to ask who. He wanted to ask why. But another part of him wondered whether she meant him, whether she had seen something in him, something weak or dangerous or unraveling. Before he could reply, she added, "I don't think it's what you believe, and I don't think it's over." She left him with that. And now, standing alone in that narrow hallway with the faint smell of laudanum circling him like a shadow, Thomas could not tell whether the danger pressing in on him came from London's dark corners or from the bottle he kept close, even as it pulled him deeper into a world he no longer understood. Either way, the nights were getting stranger, and someone, somewhere in that old building, was not finished with him yet. Thomas tried to tell himself it was nothing. Old buildings creaked. People came and went at odd hours. London breathed differently than Georgia, with its narrow lanes and shifting shadows, and maybe this was just part of its rhythm. But deep down, he knew the truth. The unease had started before the noises, before the footprints, before Clara's warning. It had started the moment he stepped off the ship, when the city's cold air brushed over him like a hand searching for cracks. He carried the kettle back to Clara's room that evening, partly because it was polite and partly because the silence of his own room felt unbearable. Clara lived in a small, tidy space that smelled faintly of lavender thread wax. She thanked him with a half-smile and asked if he wanted tea. Thomas almost said no, but his hands were shaking again, and he didn't want her to see, so he stepped inside. She poured the tea carefully, as if the act itself required steady breathing. Her fingers were slimmer than he expected, though strong from sewing. When she sat, she watched him with quiet patience, the kind that made him feel both comforted and exposed. "You're not sleeping," she said softly. He tried to laugh it off. Hard to sleep when the walls make more noise than the street. Claire didn't smile. "It's not just the walls." Thomas swallowed, the tea suddenly heavy in his throat. He didn't want to talk about it. He didn't want her seeing any more than she already had. But something in her expression, gentle, steady, made him stay seated. "Who's out there at night?" he finally asked. Clara lowered her eyes. "I don't know. I only know I've heard them too, and they stop at certain doors." He didn't need her to say which ones. He already knew. "I'm not worth watching," he whispered, almost to himself. Clara glanced up. People rarely are watched for who they are. Usually, it's for what they're hiding. Thomas stiffened. He felt the bottle's weight in his coat pocket, even though it shouldn't have been noticeable. It seemed to grow heavier the longer he stayed in that room. But Clara looked away before he could respond, giving him a measure of dignity. "In this part of London," she said, "a person doesn't need to be dangerous to attract trouble. They just need to seem vulnerable." He wasn't sure if that was meant as comfort or warning. Before he left, she gently touched his sleeve. "If you hear anything again, do not open the door." Her voice carried a seriousness he couldn't explain. As he walked back to his room, her words replayed in his mind. Vulnerable. Watched. Not over. Back in the hallway, the air felt colder. London evenings always carried a bite, but this was different, like a draft from a place that shouldn't exist. He closed his door carefully, slid the bolt into place, and sat on the edge of his narrow bed. For a moment, he considered putting the bottle away. Really putting it away, under the floorboard, in the drawer, anywhere out of reach. Maybe the doctor in Georgia had been right. Maybe he only needed it for a little while. Maybe. His hand opened the bottle before the thought finished. The warm blur spread through him, smoothing the edges of his fear. But it didn't erase the footsteps he had heard. It didn't erase Claire's expression. It didn't erase the faint heel mark outside his door. That night, he slept only in short, interrupted stretches, waking every time a floorboard popped or a carriage rattled past outside. At some point, the wind pushed against the loose window pane, creating a low groan that made him sit bolt upright. But for the rest of the night, no footsteps came. The next morning, Thomas went to work at the shipping warehouse. The fog was thick enough to hide almost the entire street, and the damp cut through his coat. London fog was unlike anything back home, soft and eerie, curling around him like it was trying to whisper something. When he reached the warehouse, Mr. Halberd, his supervisor, eyed him with a frown. "You look worse than usual," Halberd said, not unkindly. "Long night." Thomas shrugged. "Barely slept. Bad dreams." He hesitated. "Something like that." Halberd pointed to a stack of ledgers. "Copy these by evening. And try not to drift off. We lost 2 clerks this month. Don't need to lose another." Thomas worked silently, trying to focus on ink and numbers. But the bottle tugged at the back of his mind, begging for attention. He waited as long as he could, telling himself to stay steady, to stay present. But around midday, while Halberd stepped out, he slipped his coat from the hook and used just a few drops. The world softened again. But so did the details, sounds, movements, small things he should have noticed, like the man standing across the street. Thomas didn't see him right away. It wasn't until he went to dump some waste paper outside that he spotted him leaning casually against a brick wall, hat low, hands in pockets. Nothing unusual for London, but something about his posture, the stillness of it, felt wrong. People in this part of the city always moved quickly, always had somewhere to be. But this man watched the warehouse door as if he were waiting for someone, as if he were waiting for Thomas. Thomas forced himself to look away. He returned to his desk, hands trembling slightly. He tried to convince himself he was imagining patterns where there were none, that maybe the laudanum was playing tricks, that maybe Clara's warning was growing larger in his mind than it should. But when he left work that evening, the man was still there. He didn't follow Thomas. He didn't even turn his head. But his presence felt like a held breath, the kind that makes your ribs ache. Thomas walked home faster than usual, glancing over his shoulder every few moments, half expecting to see the figure behind him. But the fog swallowed the street, and no footsteps echoed after his. The bakery was warm when he stepped inside, the scent of fresh bread a strange comfort after the cold day. Mrs. Harrow nodded to him from behind the counter, wiping flour from her hands. "You're late," she said. Work ran long. She narrowed her eyes slightly, studying him. "You look pale. Just tired." She didn't argue. But as he climbed the stairs, she called after him. "Tell Clara I have her order ready. If she stops by." Thomas paused on the stairwell. "I haven't seen her today." Mrs. Harrow frowned. Strange. She never misses a Thursday. He felt a small chill crawl up his spine. He went to Clara's door. Knocked once. Twice. No answer. He pressed his ear gently to the wood. Nothing. He took a small step back, unease settling heavily in his chest. Maybe she was out running errands. Maybe she was with a friend. Maybe. A floorboard creaked inside her room. Thomas froze. Someone was in there. But it didn't sound like Clara. The step was too heavy. And for the first time since he'd come to London, Thomas wished desperately that the laudanum would blur things even more. Enough to make him forget the danger, standing just inches away, separated only by a layer of wood and the thinnest thread of courage he had left. He didn't knock again. He didn't breathe. And then, from behind Clara's door, came the soft, unmistakable sound of something being dragged. Thomas's heart pounded so hard he thought the floorboards themselves might shake. The sound behind Clara's door, soft, dragging, deliberate, filled the narrow hallway with a tension that made his skin prickle. He wanted to turn and run, to bury himself in the foggy streets outside and forget this entire building existed. But something rooted him in place, some strange mix of dread and curiosity, The part of him that had survived George's sun-scorched fields and a harsh Atlantic voyage. He pressed his ear closer to the door. The dragging stopped. Silence settled in a way that was almost worse than noise. He thought he could hear his own blood rushing in his ears. Then a whisper. He wasn't sure at first if he imagined it, the voice too soft to make out clearly. Thomas! His breath caught. He stumbled back a step, knocking against the stair railing. The sound echoed faintly, but the voice, if it had truly been a voice, did not repeat. He pressed a shaking hand to his chest, trying to still it. There was only one person in that room who could speak his name that way. But Clara's voice was lighter, steadier, and somehow calmer. This sounded rougher, hurried. Not hers. Thomas tried to remember all the advice Clara had given him. Do not open the door. Yet the urge to know, to see, gnawed at him sharper than the fear. He debated calling out, shouting, even running for help. But something held him silent. A stubborn sense of responsibility, or maybe the lingering effects of laudanum, made him pause. Whatever was inside might not be dangerous, or it might be, and he was about to learn exactly how much danger could look like. He drew in a slow, careful breath and crept closer. Every step felt heavier than the last. His boots made soft thumps against the wooden stairs, but the room beyond the door seemed to absorb them. The air smelled faintly of thread wax and flour, but beneath that, another scent hovered, iron and damp wood. Something old, something hidden. He reached the door. His hand hovered over the latch. For a moment, he closed his eyes and imagined that the entire building would collapse if he moved it, that the walls would swallow him whole. Then he heard again, the whisper. Not a word this time, just a breath, a sigh, deliberate and unnerving. His hand twitched, and before he could stop himself, he opened the door. The room was dim, lit only by the faint evening glow filtering through Clara's curtained window. Nothing moved. The furniture was in its usual places, the small sewing table with needles scattered across its surface, the wardrobe, the bed neatly made. But the floor told a different story. There were footprints, barefoot, small, moving across the room toward the wardrobe, then abruptly stopping. The drag marks Thomas had heard led directly to a heavy trunk in the corner, the kind used to store clothes and papers. The trunk was slightly ajar. Thomas felt a cold wave of realization. Something, or someone, had been inside Clara's room while she was away. And now, whether it was human or not, it had left a trace. His instincts screamed at him to close the door, to flee down the stairs, out into the fog, and never return. But curiosity, that stubborn thread that had pulled him across the Atlantic in the first place, anchored him to the spot. He took a step forward, drawn toward the trunk, toward the mystery it held. The air grew colder as he approached. He noticed the faint smell again, the metallic tang, mixed with something sweeter, almost medicinal. It made him dizzy. He steadied himself against the sewing table, his knuckles white against the edge. One final step, and then, heart hammering, he reached the trunk. It was heavier than he expected. He braced his legs and pulled the lid fully open. There was nothing immediately visible, only clothes folded neatly, papers tucked inside envelopes, and a small bottle, dark glass, the kind of bottle that made his stomach tighten. He recognized it instantly. Laudanum. Clara's bottle? No, too small, too personal. And yet, it was labeled in handwriting he didn't recognize. There was something inside that made him pause. The liquid shimmered faintly in the dim light, as if it were alive, as if it had a presence beyond the simple syrup and opiates it contained. Thomas stared at it for a long moment, feeling an odd mixture of fear and fascination. This could explain the noises. Someone could have been testing the room, looking for laudanum, maybe even targeting him. The thought made his hands tremble. He wondered if he had been underestimating the danger that London hid around every corner, behind every door, beneath every creaking floorboard. Then he heard again, a sound that froze him in place, a soft, deliberate click. The wardrobe door beside him swung open just a crack. A shadow fell across the room, thin but unmistakable. Thomas turned slowly, heart pounding in his throat, trying to keep his voice steady. "Who's there?" he demanded, though his own words sounded hollow. No answer, just a faint shift of movement. The shadow receded into the corner, and for a brief moment, Thomas thought he saw a figure. A man? A woman, before it vanished entirely. He stumbled backward, tripping slightly over the edge of the rug, and the bottle wobbled in his hand. He caught it just in time, gripping it like a lifeline. His thoughts raced. Was it a thief? A rival addict? Someone sent to scare him away? Or something else entirely? Something tied to the darker streets of London, the alleys that whispered of crimes and secrets that no one spoke of in daylight? Thomas knew one thing. He couldn't tell Clara. Not yet. She had warned him to be careful. She had hinted at danger, but she hadn't explained everything. He didn't know whether telling her would help or put her at risk. All he could do was watch, wait, and try not to fall into the patterns that had already pulled him so deep. By the time he left Clara's room, the fog outside had thickened, swallowing the street lamps in pale halos. He moved quickly, almost running, clutching the bottle to his chest, trying to convince himself that nothing was following him. But he could feel it in the corners of his vision, in the faint brush of wind that wasn't wind at all. Someone, or something, was there, waiting, watching. He returned to his own room and locked the door carefully, pressing his back against it, trying to calm the frantic beating of his heart. The laudanum sat on a nightstand, small and inviting. He considered taking just a drop, just enough to steady his nerves. But something in him hesitated. He had begun to realize that the blur it offered was no longer enough. The world outside was too sharp, too strange, too dangerous. No bottle could shield him from what had been lurking. He sat in the dim room for hours, listening. Every creak of the building made him jump. Every faint shuffle outside made him tense. And all the while, he thought about the figure in Clara's room, the small bottle in the trunk, and the whispers that had called his name. One thing became certain. Whatever was happening, it wasn't random. It wasn't coincidence. London had claimed him in ways Georgia never had, and the laudanum that had once been his refuge was now only a reminder of how fragile his safety had become. By dawn, Thomas was exhausted, yet sleep remained impossible. He moved to the window and peered into the fog-choked street. Figures moved in the mist, shadows flickering like ghosts, and he wondered if he could tell which ones were real. His mind, fogged with worry and the faint after-effects of laudanum, struggled to make sense of it all. But one thing was clear. Clara's warning had been only the beginning. The city was closing in, the mystery deepening, and Thomas knew that when night returned, he would not be alone. And somewhere in the depths of the building, or the streets beyond, the presence that had haunted him was waiting for the next move. Thomas spent the following days moving through London as if he were a ghost, gliding past crowded markets and narrow alleys, careful to keep his head down and his coat collar pulled high. Every time he glanced over his shoulder, he half expected to see the shadowy figure from Clara's room, the one whose presence had pressed so heavily on him that night. The fog seemed thicker than usual, curling around lampposts and hitching a strange weight to every footstep. It made the city feel older, larger, full of secrets just beyond reach. He realized that the streets of London were alive in ways Georgia had never been. Here, the air carried whispers, the cobblestones remembered each footfall, and people looked out for danger in subtle, almost imperceptible ways. Back in his room, he tried to make sense of the recent events. The laudanum bottle sat untouched on his nightstand, a reminder of the fragile comfort it had once offered. He knew it could calm the shaking in his hands, blur the edges of fear, and dull the ache of uncertainty. Yet, for the first time, he hesitated. He realized that dulling his senses would not protect him from what had been lurking in Clara's room, nor from the shadow that now seemed to follow him through the streets. He poured himself a cup of weak tea instead, trying to focus on the small, ordinary tasks that once felt grounding, sweeping, organizing his ledgers, even the simple act of staring out the window at the fogged streets below. Clara herself became an anchor in the days that followed. She seemed to sense that Thomas was trying to navigate something he couldn't quite name, but she did not push. Sometimes, In the quiet moments when their paths crossed on the stairwell or outside the bakery, she would glance at him with the same careful eyes that at first made him aware of the danger in his own building. She asked little, said little, but her presence carried a quiet reassurance. At the same time, it reminded him of the mystery he could not ignore. Who, or what, had been in her room? Why had it stopped at her trunk? And why did the smell of laudanum seem to cling to the traces left behind, as if it had been drawn there deliberately? Thomas spent evenings reading by candlelight, not simply to pass the time, but to give himself a sense of control over a world that had become increasingly unpredictable. Books about London's history, accounts of ship voyages, and pamphlets describing medicine and remedies in Victorian times surrounded him. He began to notice patterns, the ways in which the city's shadows had been written into stories long before he arrived. The fog, the narrow alleys, the whispers of footsteps in the night, they were all part of a larger rhythm, a rhythm he was still learning to navigate. The more he read, the more he understood that London had a way of folding people into its hidden layers, drawing them into stories that seemed to exist on the edges of memory and reality. In those same evenings, he thought often of Georgia. He remembered the sun-drenched fields and the slow, steady rhythms of life back home. He remembered the doctor who had first given him laudanum, assuring him that it was medicine, that it would ease the pain and allow him to sleep. He remembered the warm scent of his mother's cooking, the laughter of neighbors at evening gatherings, and the way the horizon stretched wide and endless. That life had seemed simple, almost predictable. London was none of that. Here, shadows could move independently of their source. People could watch without being seen, and a single misstep could lead to consequences far more complex than anything he had experienced in Georgia. Thomas began noticing small, unsettling details. Footsteps that seemed to echo after he had already passed. Curtains shifting in empty rooms. Whispers carried on the wind, just faint enough to be missed if you weren't paying close attention. Each of these things was subtle, almost imperceptible, yet together they built a sense of unease that refused to fade. He tried to convince himself that it was just the laudanum or exhaustion or the natural strangeness of a city so old and full of history. But a part of him knew better. There was an intelligence in the disturbances, a pattern he could not yet see, but one that seemed to orbit him, like a predator circling its prey. At the warehouse, Thomas kept his head down. He moved crates and copied ledgers with mechanical precision, avoiding eye contact with others whenever possible. Yet even there, he felt eyes on him. He began to notice subtle changes. A worker pausing too long near the doorway, a clerk glancing at him with something unspoken, a stranger loitering near the entrance of the building. At first, he tried to ignore it. After all, London was crowded, people were busy, and most of them were wrapped up in their own lives. But the unease persisted, growing more insistent with each passing day. He returned frequently to Clara's door, driven by a mixture of worry and the need for answers. Sometimes he would hear faint movements again, or the faint scent of something medicinal, and each time it sent a cold wave through him. He wanted to ask Clara more, to demand the truth, but each time he tried, her quiet patience reminded him that there was more to the story than she could, or would, say. Her caution hinted at danger, but it also suggested trust, a recognition that Thomas could handle more than he realized. And yet, he was still learning the limits of his own courage. The laudanum sat between relief and danger, a tool he had once relied on without question. Now, it seemed both friend and foe. Each drop he took dulled fear, but also blurred his ability to notice subtle threats. Each time he resisted, the edges of reality sharpened, and the presence following him felt more real, more immediate. Thomas realized he was caught in a delicate balance, a line drawn between self-preservation and clarity, between the comfort of forgetting and the necessity of seeing. One evening, as the city's fog thickened into a heavy, nearly impenetrable wall, Thomas made his way to the bakery with a parcel in hand. The streets were quieter than usual, and the gas lamps cast eerie, distorted shadows. Every alley looked like it could conceal a threat, every doorway a hiding place. He moved cautiously, almost instinctively, aware that someone, or something, might be watching. Inside the bakery, the warmth of the ovens and the scent of bread offered a brief respite, but it was fleeting. Mrs. Harrow noticed his tense expression and asked if he was feeling ill. He waved it off, though he could not explain the gnawing sense that followed him even into the crowded, safe space. He asked about Claire's whereabouts, and she told him she had been called away for a client in another part of the city. That was all. No further explanation, no hint of what might have been left behind in her room, nothing to assuage the persistent anxiety pressing against him from all sides. Thomas walked home that night, the fog curling around him like a living thing. He imagined the footsteps returning, the shadows slipping from corner to corner, always just beyond his sight. And yet, the laudanum bottle sat heavy in his coat pocket, a small comfort, a reminder of the world he had once controlled. He understood that he could no longer rely on it as a shield. London was teaching him that control was an illusion, and that the city and its unseen inhabitants did not yield to human will. By the time he reached his building, the fog was so thick he could barely see the doorway. The streets were silent, almost oppressively so, and as he climbed the stairs to his room, every creak of the wood seemed amplified, each sound a potential signal. When he reached his door, he paused, hand on the knob, listening. A faint scuffing, almost like a chair being moved, came from somewhere above. He froze, the laudanum bottle suddenly heavier than ever. He realized that whatever was happening, it was far from over. Thomas opened his door slowly, the dim candlelight spilling into the hall. Everything seemed normal at first glance. The rug in place, the walls unmarked, no immediate sign of anyone having been there. Yet instinct told him otherwise. The presence was still here, close, patient, watching. The fog outside pressed against the window like a silent accomplice. And in that moment, Thomas understood that his arrival in London had done more than place him in a new city. It had placed him in the path of something he did not yet understand, something that would not reveal itself lightly, and something that might be waiting for the moment he let his guard down. And as he sat on the edge of his bed, staring at the bottle, Thomas realized that the city's secrets were only beginning to unravel. The nights would grow darker, the shadows longer, and the whispers louder. And for him, for Thomas Wren, the journey through London's hidden layers had only just begun. Thomas did not sleep that night. Not for long, not for real. He lay on his narrow bed, staring at the flickering candle, listening to the building breathe around him. Every creak, every sigh of timber sounded amplified. Even the wind outside seemed to have a pulse, brushing against the window pane in patterns that felt deliberate. His hand rested on the laudanum bottle. For the first time, it did not feel like a friend. It felt like a reminder of his vulnerability, a signal of how dependent he had become on something that dulled both fear and awareness. By dawn, he resolved to move cautiously, to act as if he were unseen, yet fully aware. London demanded vigilance in ways Georgia never had. In Savannah, people spoke plainly, their dangers visible in sunburned faces and sharp words. Here, danger hid in shadows, in silent footsteps, in fog curling around corners. Thomas dressed quickly, keeping his coat buttoned high and his hat low. He needed purpose, a plan, something to anchor him beyond the bottle and the creeping fear that pressed against his mind. He returned to the warehouse, moving with the practiced motions of someone who had spent hours learning to become invisible while still performing the necessary work. He carried crates, copied ledgers, and answered brief questions without giving himself away. Yet the unease from Clara's room followed him. Every now and then, he thought he saw the faint outline of a figure in the distance, always watching, always waiting. He told himself it was the fog, the shadows of chimneys, the shifting shapes of the city. But the feeling persisted. Thomas had learned that observation was as much survival as any weapon. He began to notice patterns in the warehouse and its surroundings. Delivery men who lingered too long, clerks who glanced repeatedly toward the rear entrance, the way certain streets seemed emptier at times when shadows grew long. He could not prove anything, Yet instinct told him that someone had begun to mark him, to measure him. His thoughts returned often to Clara's warning. People rarely are watched for who they are. Usually, it's for what they're hiding. He wondered what he was hiding. Not the laudanum itself. He had been careless with that enough already. But something else. A weakness, a habit, a secret invisible in daylight, but visible in shadow. Perhaps it was his dependence on the bottle, the tremor in his hands when he did not take it, the subtle way his movements became slower, less precise. Or perhaps it was the way he carried himself, always slightly withdrawn, careful not to reveal more than necessary. Whatever it was, it seemed to have drawn attention. That evening, Thomas left the warehouse earlier than usual, citing a vague headache. The fog had returned, denser this time, rolling through Whitechapel with a weight that seemed almost tangible. He kept to the main streets at first, but the edges of his vision caught movement in the narrow alleys, dark figures slipping into shadows as he approached. He forced himself to ignore them. He had to move like someone who belonged, like someone who was simply another pedestrian in the endless flow of London life. Yet even as he walked, his mind kept returning to Clara. She had become a strange fixture in his thoughts, both comforting and unsettling. She had warned him, yet offered no details. She had recognized something in him, and perhaps he had recognized something in her. There was an unspoken trust forming between them, fragile but real, yet it was entangled in fear and mystery. He thought of her carefully arranged room, the trunk, the bottle, and the shadowy figure that had slipped past him so easily. He wondered if she even knew what she had returned to after stepping out that afternoon. He reached her street, silent and narrow, lined with buildings that leaned slightly as if they were eavesdropping on the inhabitants below. The windows glowed faintly, and the fog swirled around the street lamps, stretching their light into dim halos. Thomas paused outside her door, debating whether he should knock, but hesitation won. He could not yet explain his fear without betraying how much he had already noticed. So he moved on, the footsteps of others swallowed by the fog, leaving him alone with the creeping sense that he was being followed, always just at the edge of perception. Days passed in a rhythm of cautious work, subtle observation, and restless nights. Thomas began to see patterns in the city that he had not noticed before. Certain streets seemed to loop back in impossible ways. Corners that should have led to one alley instead opened into another. The fog thickened selectively, hiding some details while revealing others. People who lingered outside shops or warehouses often disappeared when approached. The city itself seemed to play tricks, and Thomas realized that being alert was only part of survival. Understanding the city's rhythm was the other part. At the warehouse, his attention shifted from the crates and ledgers to the people. He began noticing the subtle changes in behavior. A clerk who paused too long near the back door. A deliverman who lingered near the stairs instead of moving on. The way a man in a long coat seemed to appear at different locations along the street, as if he were measuring the same path repeatedly. Thomas's mind worked to connect these fragments, each small observation adding to a larger, invisible picture. And yet, nothing tangible presented itself. Every discovery only deepened the tension, increased the sense that someone or something was orchestrating events in a way he could not yet see. At night, his dreams were restless. The laudanum that once offered relief now brought visions that were neither comforting nor predictable. Shadows shifted into shapes that whispered. Objects and rooms seemed to move when unobserved, and the city itself felt alive, pressing against him with unseen fingers. He woke sweating, heart racing, often to the faintest sounds from the building. A floorboard creaking, a window rattling, or the whisper of movement in a corridor. Sometimes it was enough to convince him that the figure from Clara's room had returned. Other times he questioned his own mind, wondering if the laudanum was bending perception in ways that reality could not match. Thomas began keeping a journal, scribbling observations, dates, and times. He wrote down the patterns of movement he noticed in the streets, the faint noises in the building, the moments when he felt the city itself leaning in. He recorded the laudanum doses he had taken, attempting to track the delicate balance between clarity and relief. The journal became both a tool and a talisman, a way to impose order on a world that seemed increasingly chaotic. Each entry deepened his understanding of his own vulnerability, yet also reinforced his determination to survive, to understand, and to uncover the truth behind the shadows that had claimed his attention. Clara remained a steady presence, though not always directly. Sometimes, Thomas caught glimpses of her from his window, moving along the fog-draped streets, carrying bundles of thread or fabric. Her careful attention to small details, the way she observed the city without seeming to, reminded him that awareness could be protective, even in a place as unpredictable as London. He found himself wondering what she knew, what she had seen, and whether she had ever faced the same presence that had visited her room, the figure that now seemed to stalk him in subtle ways. One evening, as Thomas returned from the warehouse, he noticed a faint movement across the street, near a row of shuttered shops. A figure, tall and indistinct, paused and then disappeared into an alley. His pulse quickened. He knew this time it was not imagination. The figure was deliberate, patient, measuring him, watching him in a way that made it clear they knew more than he did. Thomas pressed himself against the wall, considering his next move. He could run, try to lose the figure in the fog, or he could continue to his room, pretending nothing had happened. The latter one. He moved quickly but cautiously, reaching his building and slipping inside. The hallway was silent, the faint scent of thread wax and bread drifting up from below. He climbed the stairs to his room, breathing shallowly, aware that any misstep could betray him. The laudanum sat on the nightstand. He considered it but hesitated. The bottle could blur his fear, yes, but it could not reveal the truth. Thomas realized that London had become a test of awareness, patience, and courage. The fog, the alleys, the creaking floors, and the watching figures were all part of a pattern he had yet to decipher. Clara's warning had been only the beginning, the first layer of a mystery that had begun to consume him. Every day, every moment, he felt the city pressing closer, the shadows waiting for him to falter. And he understood, with a clarity he could not ignore, that what had started in Clara's room, the shadow, the drag marks, the laudanum bottle, was only the first sign of something far larger, something that would not reveal itself easily, and something that might not be satisfied with patience. As he lay in bed that night, Thomas stared at the ceiling, listening to the building settle, listening to the wind whisper through the streets. Every instinct told him that the city's secrets were just beginning to unravel, that the presence in the fog would return, and that his understanding of London, and of himself, would be tested in ways he could not yet imagine. And somewhere, just beyond the reach of the dim candlelight, he felt the quiet certainty that he was being watched, studied, and that the mystery he had stumbled into was only growing darker. Thomas awoke before dawn, as he often did now, to the sound of the city breathing through fog and chimney smoke. London had a rhythm all its own, and it pressed against him in ways Georgia never had. The distant clatter of carts on cobblestones, the low hum of voices from alleyways, and the occasional scrape of wood against wood somewhere in the building. His mind raced as he dressed quickly, avoiding the laudanum for now, knowing that clarity, not dullness, was what he needed if he was to make sense of the shadows pressing in around him. The warehouse was quiet that morning, the air damp and heavy, the usual bustle delayed by fog that seemed to seep through every corner of the city. Thomas moved with careful precision, stacking crates, checking ledgers, and listening. He was aware of every footstep, every whispered conversation. His co-workers appeared ordinary, yet he noticed subtle differences, an extra glance, a pause in movement, the way one clerk seemed to glance toward the rear door more often than necessary. These small anomalies gnawed at him. The city was teaching him, slowly, that danger was rarely obvious. It hid in plain sight, and Thomas was beginning to see just enough to feel unease without full understanding. By mid-morning, he was approached by a delivery man named Felix, a wiry young man with quick hands and sharper eyes. Felix had been at the warehouse for only a few months, but he carried himself like someone used to reading people before they spoke. "You new in the building?" he asked casually, though Thomas could see the way his eyes lingered just a little too long. "Yes," Thomas replied. "Only arrived a few weeks ago." Felix nodded, seeming to consider the answer. "Don't take things at face value here," he said softly. "The city isn't what it looks like. Folks move, disappear, appear in places they shouldn't. Keep your eyes open." Thomas forced a smile, though his pulse quickened. He wanted to ask Felix if he knew about the shadow in Clara's room, about the drag marks on the floor, about the bottle of laudanum. But the words caught in his throat. Instead, he nodded politely and returned to his work, though Felix's warning nod at him. Perhaps the city itself had eyes, or perhaps it was just the people who moved through it, quietly measuring him. By evening, Thomas's thoughts kept returning to Clara. He could not shake the feeling that she was more than just a friend, more than a neighbor quietly observing the world. She had seen him, truly seen him, in a way no one else had. Her warning had been careful, deliberate, and it carried weight he could not ignore. He thought about her room, the trunk, the footprints, and the strange bottle. There were layers to this mystery, layers Thomas had not yet begun to understand, and he wondered how much she knew, or if she, too, was caught in the same web of observation. That night, Thomas walked slowly past her door. The fog hung thick over the street, curling into every corner and swallowing sound. He thought he heard a soft creak from the stairwell. A shiver ran down his spine. He stopped, listening. Nothing moved, yet instinct told him he was not alone. He wondered if the figure from before had returned, whether it was human or something else entirely. His hand hovered near the laudanum bottle in his coat pocket, yet he did not take it. Clarity mattered more than comfort now. Back in his room, he tried to examine the events from multiple angles. One thread was obvious. Someone had been in Clara's room while she was away. But why? Was it a thief, a rival addict, someone interested in the bottle? Or was it something deeper, something connected to the city itself, to the shadows that seemed to move independently of people? He began to consider patterns, timing, movement, the way fog and darkness altered perception. Every possibility seemed both plausible and terrifying. Meanwhile, a subtle subplot developed beyond Thomas's direct observation. Felix, the delivery man, had noticed subtle irregularities in the neighborhood as well. He had seen shadows where none should be, strangers appearing and disappearing, and whispers in alleys that carried meaning beyond casual conversation. He had begun taking notes, recording times and locations, and had started observing Thomas in small, discreet ways. Felix was cautious, careful not to reveal that he noticed more than he let on. Yet he was part of the same web now, connected to the same questions and the same growing tension. At the warehouse, Thomas noticed a small change in Mr. Halbert's behavior as well. The supervisor, usually blunt and straightforward, had begun lingering near certain crates and ledgers, as though examining them for more than just accuracy. Halbert's eyes darted more frequently toward the street, the stairwell, the entrances, and he occasionally muttered under his breath in a way Thomas could not quite catch. The old routine of the warehouse was shifting, and Thomas realized that he was not the only one sensing something unusual. Others might be aware of the presence that stalked him, even if they could not name it. One evening, Thomas returned from the bakery to find a note slipped under his door. It was small, written in careful, neat handwriting. "Do not trust what you see. Some things are not meant to be followed. But pay attention, someone is waiting." He read the words over and over, his pulse quickening. No signature, no indication of who had left it. The handwriting was familiar, yet unreadable. A warning, or challenge. Thomas realized that the city had begun speaking to him directly in subtle, cryptic ways. He spent the night trying to reconstruct the events leading up to the note. He remembered the shadow in Clara's room, the footprints, the bottle of laudanum, the footsteps outside, and the stranger glimpsed in the fog. All these threads intersected, forming a pattern that he could not yet comprehend. The note confirmed one thing. He was being watched, studied, and drawn into a web far larger than he had imagined. The tension began to grow in more personal ways as well. Thomas noticed changes in his own behavior. His reliance on laudanum, once casual and predictable, had shifted. Some nights he avoided it entirely, trying to sharpen his awareness, while other nights he took only a drop to steady his shaking hands. The substance no longer offered comfort. It highlighted his vulnerabilities. He realized that his addiction, once a shield, was now part of the conflict itself, both weakening and protecting him in ways he could not fully control. The city pressed in relentlessly. Thomas began paying attention to the fog, to the movement of the gas lamps, to the way shadows fell at different times of day. He noticed corners where noise seemed to bend, alleys where movement seemed slower or faster than it should, and people who appeared where logic said they could not. London was no longer just a city. It was a living puzzle, and he was at its center. Meanwhile, Clara's perspective remained partially hidden, adding a second angle to the conflict. She had her own awareness, her own observations of the neighborhood, and her own suspicions. She had noticed figures moving in and out of Thomas's building, strange shifts in the street's rhythm, and odd traces left behind in her room before she had returned. Clara's caution was deliberate, her intelligence sharp. Yet she had not told Thomas everything, both to protect him and because she could not yet fully understand what they were facing. The city, the shadows, the whispers, the subtle surveillance. These forces intertwined with Thomas's own vulnerabilities, creating a complex conflict that had no simple resolution. Every step he took seemed to bring him closer to the truth, but also deeper into danger. Every observation raised new questions, and every small piece of clarity revealed another layer of uncertainty. By the end of the week, Thomas realized that the shadow in Clara's room was only the beginning. The city had eyes everywhere, watching, waiting, testing him. Felix's quiet observations, Halbert's subtle shifts, the note under the door, all were fragments of a pattern he could not yet decipher. And through it all, the laudanum loomed, a double-edged tether between clarity and weakness. As he climbed the stairs to his room that night, Thomas felt the familiar prickle of unease. The candle flickered, casting strange shapes across the walls. Somewhere in the building, or in the fog outside, someone was moving, and he knew with a sinking certainty that when the presence made itself fully known, he would have to face it, with or without the fragile comfort of the bottle by his side. The city's mysteries were only deepening, the tension growing with every step, every shadow, every whisper. And Thomas realized that he had entered a game he did not yet understand, with stakes he could not yet measure. The threads of observation, danger, and his own vulnerability had woven together, and the story was far from over. Every night promised more questions. Every day offered no relief, and somewhere, just beyond reach, the presence waiting in the fog was preparing for the next move. Thomas woke to the creak of the floor above his room, a noise so subtle he could have mistaken it for the building settling, but he didn't. His heart sank instantly. He had learned the difference between ordinary sounds and the deliberate movement of something alive, something waiting. The fog outside pressed against the windows like a wall, thick and impenetrable, but inside, the small apartment seemed just as heavy with anticipation. The laudanum bottle sat on the nightstand, innocuous, yet it carried the weight of decisions he hadn't yet made, whether to dull his senses or face the city as it truly was, unblurred and unshielded. He dressed quickly and moved toward the door, every step measured, careful. Even with the candle burning low, shadows clung to corners, distorting familiar shapes into strangers. Thomas had begun noticing how easy it was to be deceived here. The city seemed to bend perception in ways Georgia never had. At the warehouse, he had seen patterns emerge and fade, hints of observation that might have been coincidence or might not. The city was teaching him patience and attentiveness, a lesson both necessary and frightening. Clara was nowhere to be seen when he passed her door. Her room, neat as ever, gave no sign of recent disturbance. The trunk remained closed, unassuming, yet Thomas's memory replayed the previous encounter, the drag marks, the bottle that was not hers. He felt the tug of anxiety, as if it were magnetic, pulling him toward questions that had no clear answers. The note he'd found earlier under his door haunted him still. Do not trust what you see. Some things are not meant to be followed. But pay attention, someone is waiting. Thomas walked to the warehouse, the fog curling around him in thick white waves. It was the kind of fog that swallowed sound, leaving only the echo of your own footsteps or the distant bell of a carriage that seemed impossibly close. He moved quickly, keeping to the main streets, yet his eyes constantly flicked to alleyways, corners, and doorways. Every shadow was suspect, every movement potentially significant. Inside the warehouse, the rhythm of work did little to ease his mind. Mr. Halbert's presence had grown heavier in recent days. The man's eyes lingered on Thomas a little too long. His questions carried a hint of scrutiny beyond routine supervision. Thomas wondered whether Halbert had noticed the same subtle irregularities he had. The stranger in the fog, the footprints in Clara's room, the unexplainable presence in the building. Was the supervisor merely cautious, or was he part of the pattern, observing as carefully as the figure Thomas could not yet identify? Felix approached him quietly, hands tucked in his coat pockets, voice low. You see it too, don't you? Thomas frowned. See what? Shadows, Felix said, glancing over his shoulder. Figures where there shouldn't be. People moving or not moving. There's something in the streets, and it watches. Thomas nodded slowly, realizing he was not imagining things, that the city had woven a web in which more than one person was entangled. Felix's quiet vigilance offered a strange sense of camaraderie. Yet it also confirmed that the tension he felt was real, that the presence in Clara's room had not been a one-time event. There was more at play, and the city itself seemed determined to test him. As evening fell, Thomas returned to the streets, the fog thick enough that even familiar buildings seemed distorted, alien. He paused outside Clara's door, considering whether to knock, whether to seek guidance, whether to confess the unease that had taken root in his mind. He didn't. The shadows beyond the window whispered of patience, of waiting for him to act or make a mistake. Instead, he moved onward, focusing on survival, on observation, on the small victories of noticing things others overlooked. Later, he began tracing the edges of the city on foot, trying to understand the rhythm of the streets, the patterns of movement, the way shadows elongated and shrank with the dim glow of gas lamps. He noted alleyways where echoes seemed delayed, where fog pooled unnaturally, where sound seemed absorbed before reaching the street. It was exhausting work, mentally and physically, yet necessary. He realized that London demanded more than courage. It demanded awareness, patience, and the ability to see patterns before they became threats. Back at the apartment, he found Clara waiting outside the bakery, carrying a bundle of folded fabric. She greeted him with a quiet smile, though her eyes hinted at the same awareness he had begun to recognize in himself. Evening, she said. The fog's thick tonight. Be careful. Thomas nodded, unsure how to respond. You've noticed it too? He asked finally, voice low. She looked away for a moment before replying. Some things are better observed than discussed. But yes, I've seen irregularities, strange movements, footsteps that don't belong, shadows where there shouldn't be any. I've tried to ignore them, but the city doesn't let you. He considered her words, realizing that their experiences were intersecting in ways neither fully understood. She had her own perspective, her own observations, and perhaps her own fears. Yet the city had drawn them both into its rhythm, into its web, in ways they could not yet untangle. That night, Thomas could not sleep. He sat by the window, listening, noting, recording. The sounds of London at night, the distant clatter of carts, the echo of voices, the whisper of wind through chimneys, carried meanings he could not fully decipher, yet he felt certain were significant. Something was moving through the streets, something deliberate, and he could not help but wonder if the presence had been aware of his every action, even as he observed, even as he tried to anticipate its next move. He thought about the bottle of laudanum. Once a source of comfort, it had become a lens through which the city's tension sharpened. Each drop dulled fear, but also dulled awareness. And each night, without it, left him vulnerable, exposed to the unseen eyes of the streets. Thomas understood that he had to balance his need for clarity with the temptation of escape, and that failure to maintain that balance could cost him more than sleep. It could cost him safety, or worse. Meanwhile, small patterns began to emerge. Felix's casual observations intersected with Thomas's own notes, revealing subtle consistencies. The timing of the stranger's appearances, the way fog seemed to gather in certain streets, the faint traces left behind in corners and doorways. Yet every revelation brought more questions than answers. The threads of observation tangled with uncertainty, and a presence lurking in the shadows remained just out of reach, always patient, always waiting. Even Clara's role deepened the complexity. Thomas realized that she, too, had her own careful monitoring of the streets. Her routines, her errands, her awareness of the neighborhood suggested knowledge and skill he had not initially recognized. She had been observing not only him, but the city itself, and perhaps the figure that haunted his nights. Yet she revealed only fragments, letting Thomas learn through his own mistakes and discoveries. The unspoken trust between them grew alongside the tension, a delicate balance of caution, shared observation, and mutual reliance. One evening, Thomas returned to his room to find a faint, metallic scent in the hallway. He paused, listening. No footsteps, no voices, yet the air felt charged, alive. Something had moved through the space while he was away. His mind immediately returned to the shadows, the note, the trunk, the bottle. The city was no longer just a backdrop. It was an active participant, testing him, shaping his movements, and teaching him that patience alone would not suffice. Thomas felt a mix of fear and determination. The threads of the mystery had multiplied. The shadow in Clara's room, the footprints, the stranger in the fog, the note, Felix's quiet observations, Halbert's scrutiny, and the subtle signs he could not yet fully interpret. Each thread connected to the others in ways he could not see, and yet their convergence felt inevitable. The tension was no longer just about survival. It was about understanding, about seeing the unseen, about learning the rules of a city that did not play fair. He sat at his desk and began to map the streets, the movements he had noticed, the appearances and disappearances of shadows, and the intersections of his own routine with those of others. The fog outside deepened, curling around lampposts, swallowing entire blocks, and he realized that each night offered new possibilities and new threats. He understood that what had begun with a shadow in Clara's room was now a larger, more complex conflict, a city alive with observation, secrecy, and danger, in which every action, every hesitation, every moment of clarity or dullness carried weight. Thomas understood one thing clearly. He could not confront the city blindly, nor could he rely solely on laudanum to soften the edges of reality. He had to learn, adapt, and observe. And the presence that stalked him, patient and deliberate, would return. And when it did, he would have to be ready. The city's mysteries were only growing deeper, the tension sharper, and the threads of observation, fear, and hidden truths more entangled. And Thomas knew that he was far from understanding the full scope of what awaited him in London's fog-drenched streets, where shadows held secrets, and every step could reveal, or conceal, a truth he was not yet prepared to face. Thomas's nights had begun to blur into a strange rhythm, a mixture of observation, restless pacing, and attempts at brief, shallow sleep. The fog outside his window no longer felt like a natural phenomenon. It was alive in his mind, curling into shapes and patterns, folding the city streets into an endless maze. Every creak of timber, every distant whisper of conversation, seemed charged with meaning. He had come to realize that London demanded more than attention. It demanded interpretation. Every detail mattered. Every shadow could conceal a threat or a clue. That morning, Thomas took a long walk before the warehouse opened, hoping to better understand the city's pulse. He moved along quieter streets, noting how the fog clung to corners, how the gas lamps cast distorted halos, and how people's movements seemed deliberate, almost measured. A child running across the street, a pair of merchants unloading crates, a man adjusting his coat in a doorway. All became part of a mental map he was building. Something was happening in these streets, something that others did not, or could not, see, and he needed to be ready. At the warehouse, Mr. Halbert's scrutiny had deepened. The supervisor would pass Thomas's workbench, pause, and glance at the ledgers with an expression that suggested he was seeing more than just numbers. Thomas began noticing small, repeated patterns in Halbert's behavior. The way he lingered near certain crates, the slight hesitations in his speech when others approached, the careful way he moved along the aisles as if counting steps or noting details invisible to most. Thomas could not be certain, but he began to suspect that Halbert, like himself, was trying to observe something more than the warehouse routine. Felix approached him again, this time with more urgency. "I've seen it," he said quietly, glancing around as if the fog itself could overhear. "I don't know what it is yet, but I've seen shadows that move without people, corners where footsteps echo before they happen. You're not imagining it, Thomas. Something's watching." Thomas nodded, feeling a mix of relief and dread. That he was not alone in noticing the subtle irregularities brought comfort, but it also confirmed that the presence, or presences, were persistent and perhaps even coordinated in ways he could not yet comprehend. "Have you noticed timing?" he asked. "Patterns?" Felix shook his head. "Not enough yet, but we'll find it." His tone was quiet, almost a whisper, yet firm. He had begun observing too, quietly, subtly, in ways that mirrored Thomas's own attention to detail. By evening, Thomas decided to visit Clara. The fog had thickened, rolling into alleys and curling around the lampposts, swallowing familiar street corners in a gray haze. Each step brought tension. Each shadow seemed to twist into something alive. Clara's building emerged through the mist, the windows dimly glowing. Thomas paused, considering how to approach. The events in her room, the note under his door, the shadows, they had all converged into a single, unresolved tension, and he needed perspective. Clara opened the door before he could knock. She studied him carefully, her eyes sharp. "You've noticed too," she said, almost as a statement rather than a question. Thomas nodded. "I can't explain it," he admitted, "but I know the city isn't as simple as it seems. Shadows move, footsteps echo strangely. There's a presence I can't name." Clara stepped aside to let him in. Her room was neat, orderly, yet there were subtle signs she had been watching, observing. The slight displacement of a rug, the careful arrangement of books on the shelf, a small notebook tucked under a corner of the trunk. She motioned toward a chair. "Sit," she said softly. "We may be in deeper than we realize." Thomas sank into the chair, the fog pressing against the windows, a reminder that the city beyond was alive and unknowable. Clara began speaking, not about the specifics he had seen, but about patterns, the way shadows moved across buildings, the faint traces left in alleyways, the irregular timing of certain footsteps. She spoke in careful observations, as if cataloging a puzzle. "I've noticed the presence," she said quietly. "It's deliberate. It watches, but it doesn't always act. Sometimes it waits, testing, learning. That's the part that makes it dangerous." Thomas listened, realizing that she had been aware far longer than he had suspected. Her knowledge added layers to the conflict he was already navigating. It wasn't simply about observation or survival, but about understanding the rhythms of a city that seemed to have intelligence of its own, one that could study, test, and manipulate in subtle, insidious ways. The two of them began comparing notes. Felix's observations, Thomas's experiences, Clara's awareness. They formed a rough map of activity. Streets where movement seemed delayed, corners where shadows lingered longer than they should, times when footsteps repeated as if the city were testing its own echo. Each thread added tension. Each piece of the puzzle suggested patterns that were almost, but not entirely, perceptible. The conflict had grown beyond a single building or a single shadow. It had expanded into the city itself. Over the next few days, Thomas's routine shifted. He avoided the laudanum more often, relying instead on heightened observation, which left him tense, exhausted, but more aware. He moved through streets with a careful attention to angles, reflections, and the subtle shifts in human behavior. Every corner could reveal a clue or a trap. Every figure in the fog could be friend, enemy, or neither. The city had become a living puzzle, and he was both player and observer. Meanwhile, small anomalies began to appear in the warehouse. Crates that had been stacked carefully were slightly shifted. Ledgers opened to pages he hadn't touched, and Halbert's presence grew more insistent. The supervisor no longer simply monitored work. He measured, observed, and waited. Thomas suspected Halbert might be aware of the same patterns, or perhaps he was unknowingly part of them. Each day's routine had transformed into a web of subtle observation, layered tension, and calculated patience. Clara, too, became an active participant. She guided Thomas in reading signs he might have otherwise overlooked. Footprints in damp alleys, subtle scratches on door frames, faint traces of substances left in buildings. She helped him see the city not as a static environment, but as a living entity, one that could test him, warn him, and manipulate events to suit its own hidden design. Their shared observations deepened the tension, but also built a fragile trust. They were no longer alone in navigating the city's shadows. The presence itself escalated in subtle ways. Thomas noticed movement just beyond his peripheral vision, shapes that shifted when he blinked, sounds that preceded footsteps he could not yet trace. One night, he found a small scrap of paper slipped under the warehouse door, etched with a single line. "You're noticing too much. Be careful where you step." The handwriting was unfamiliar, yet deliberate. It confirmed that the presence was aware of him, tracking him, and perhaps responding to his growing awareness. Tension began to manifest physically. Thomas's hands shook slightly, whether from fatigue or the faint withdrawal from laudanum, he wasn't sure. His mind raced constantly, cataloging details, comparing observations, and imagining outcomes. Every shadow, every sound, every movement became part of a larger, unseen narrative. And Clara's quiet, deliberate guidance kept him tethered to reality while pushing him toward understanding. The web of conflict now stretched in multiple directions. The mysterious presence that haunted him, the subtle anomalies in the warehouse, the hidden layers of the city itself, and the fragile human connections with Clara and Felix. Each element interacted with the others, creating tension that refused to resolve. And Thomas understood, more fully than ever, that he had stepped into a world in which observation and action were inseparable, and in which a single misstep could tip the balance. By the end of the week, Thomas noticed a pattern emerging. The presence seemed to test him at predictable intervals, yet varied just enough to prevent certainty. He realized the city itself might be part of the test, its fog, shadows, and alleys functioning almost as instruments of measurement. Each night's tension felt heavier, each day's observations more urgent. And yet, he also recognized a strange opportunity. The more he observed, the more he began to anticipate, and the more he could see the connections forming between separate events, separate movements, and separate individuals. And so, Thomas prepared himself for the nights ahead. The city waited, alive and patient, and the presence would return. The shadows had grown more deliberate, more coordinated, and the threads of observation, human and otherwise, had become tangled in ways he had yet to understand. The tension was no longer simply external. It had penetrated into his mind, his senses, his very perception of reality. Thomas realized he was no longer merely a participant in the city's rhythm. He was part of it, a node in a network of observation, awareness, and waiting. Every night promised new challenges. Every shadow might conceal another layer of the mystery, and every interaction, whether with Clara, Felix, or the people of the streets, was a potential clue in a puzzle whose solution remained just out of reach. As he finally climbed the stairs to his apartment, fog curling around the building like living tendrils, Thomas knew one thing with certainty. The city had drawn him in completely, and the conflict that had begun in a single room with a shadow and a bottle of laudanum had expanded into something far larger, far more complex, and far more dangerous than he could yet see. And somewhere beyond the candlelight, beyond the fog, the presence waited, patient and deliberate, ready to test him again. The fog that night was thicker than ever, clinging to the streets like a living shroud. Thomas felt it press against his skin as he stepped out of his apartment, each breath visible in small, trembling clouds. He had learned to read the city in subtle ways. The rhythm of footsteps, the faint echo of carts, the unnatural stillness of certain alleyways. But tonight, even his trained senses seemed inadequate. Something had changed. The city felt charged, as if the shadows themselves were aware of him in a more intentional, almost predatory way. He moved quickly through narrow streets, eyes darting to every corner. A lamp flickered, briefly illuminating a figure at the end of an alley, though when he blinked, it was gone. His pulse raced, every muscle tense. He considered taking a dose of laudanum to steady himself, but the risk of dull perception was too great. The city demanded sharpness now, clarity, and he could feel the stakes rising with each step. At the warehouse, the atmosphere had shifted. Crates were stacked in odd arrangements, ledgers left open to pages he hadn't touched. Halberd lingered near the rear entrance, his expression inscrutable, eyes flicking toward Thomas with a weight that suggested both caution and suspicion. Thomas wondered if Halberd had seen something, had noticed the same irregularities, or if he himself had become a subject of observation in ways he could not yet understand. Felix was already there, leaning against a wall, quiet and alert, as if he too felt the city's tension pressing inward. Thomas caught a whispered movement behind a stack of crates and froze. The air seemed to thicken, and he realized the presence was here, closer than it had ever been. A chill ran down his spine as he remembered the note. "You're noticing too much. Be careful where you step." He hadn't imagined it. The city itself had become an instrument of testing, a maze of fog and shadow where observation could mean survival or failure. Clara's warning echoed in his mind. Some things are not meant to be followed. But pay attention, someone is waiting. He had tried to interpret it in days past, but now the meaning pressed upon him with urgency. The waiting was not passive. The presence had been measuring, learning, and it was ready to act. Every creak of wood, every shift in the fog, every faint sound became a potential signal of imminent danger. The hours dragged. Thomas and Felix moved cautiously through the warehouse, checking crates, observing Halberd, and noting small inconsistencies. The shadows seemed alive, stretching across walls, gathering in corners, coiling along the floor like smoke. Thomas's mind raced, connecting patterns, predicting movements, testing each scenario in his head. Every possibility held risk. Every wrong step could trigger something he could not yet see. When the evening deepened into night, Thomas decided to check the streets beyond the warehouse. He needed to understand the city's rhythm, to see if the presence was external as well as internal. Clara had agreed to meet him briefly at a nearby corner, offering the possibility of shared insight, though they both knew time was short. As he stepped into the fog, every familiar street seemed alien, every lamp distorted by the swirling mist. He reached the designated corner and saw Clara emerging from the fog, her eyes sharp, her movements deliberate. "It's closer tonight," she said quietly, her voice barely audible above the wind. "The fog isn't hiding it anymore. It's testing, moving, almost taunting." Thomas nodded, tension coiling in his chest. "I've felt it in the warehouse. It's patient, calculating, and it knows we're aware." Clara's gaze drifted down the street. "We have to move carefully. Watch the alleys, the shadows, the reflections. It's everywhere." The two of them began walking together, each step measured, each breath shallow. Shadows stretched unnaturally across walls and cobblestones, and Thomas felt them press against his mind, whispering in patterns he could not yet interpret. At one point, a figure appeared at the far end of the street, then vanished when he blinked. He knew it was no trick of the fog. Someone, or something, was orchestrating events, testing their awareness. Felix's words from days earlier returned in a flash. You're not imagining it. Something's watching. Now, the watching felt deliberate, calculated, and imminent. Every nerve in Thomas's body was alive with tension. Every movement synchronized to avoid revealing themselves prematurely. They reached a small alleyway, one of the few open spaces where the fog thinned slightly. The sound of distant footsteps echoed strangely, as if the alley itself was amplifying or distorting movement. Thomas pressed against the wall, listening. Clara mirrored his actions, her breath visible in the cold air. The presence had grown bolder, closer, and he realized they were no longer just being observed. They were being guided, herded, perhaps even cornered. Suddenly, a faint metallic scrape echoed from deeper within the alley. Thomas tensed. He glanced at Clara. She nodded slightly, understanding the same instinctive warning he felt. Every shadow seemed alive now, coiling, stretching, waiting for him to falter. The fog shifted, curling toward them, and for a brief moment, the alley seemed endless, walls stretching impossibly high, the night air thick with tension. Then movement, a shadow slipping along the side of a building, distant but deliberate. Thomas's pulse quickened. He could not see the figure fully, yet he knew it was not human in the ordinary sense. The timing, the precision, the way it interacted with the fog and the alley suggested intelligence, calculation, and intent. The city itself had become a stage, and the presence was the director, orchestrating events in a way that left Thomas and Clara both participants and observers, with danger pressing closer at every step. They began to retreat, moving in silence, careful not to break the rhythm of their awareness. Yet even as they moved, Thomas felt the tension tighten, an invisible cord drawing them toward a confrontation he could not yet anticipate. Every alleyway, every shadow, every faint sound now carried meaning. The presence was patient, and patience, he realized, was far more terrifying than haste. Reaching the edge of the fog, Thomas paused, sensing a shift in the air. The alley behind him felt heavier, charged, as if it were holding back a presence just out of reach. Clara's hand brushed against his arm briefly, a silent confirmation that she felt it too. Every instinct screamed that something was about to happen, that the culmination of all the patterns, all the observations, all the patient watching was approaching. For a long moment, neither spoke. The fog swirled around them, shadows shifting, the city itself seeming to hold its breath. Thomas's mind raced, cataloging every observation, every clue, every moment that had led to this point. The presence was closer than ever, patient and deliberate, and he understood with a chilling clarity that the climax was near. Every small misstep, every lapse in attention could unravel the delicate balance they had maintained. And then, as if the fog had answered the unspoken tension, a movement flickered at the edge of vision. A figure, tall and indistinct, emerging from mist. Thomas froze, heart pounding, mind alert, aware that everything he had prepared for, the observations, the patterns, the understanding of the city's rhythms, would be tested in the moments to come. The alley seemed to contract around them, the shadows stretching, folding, pressing in, and for the first time, Thomas realized that the confrontation was no longer avoidable. The city held its breath with them, the fog thickened, and the presence advanced, deliberate and patient, as if savoring the final moments before the inevitable collision. Thomas glanced at Clara, noting the same taut tension mirrored in her eyes. They were on the edge of discovery, on the precipice of revelation, yet neither fully understood the force they were about to face. The night had reached its maximum suspense, the threads of observation, fear, and hidden intent pulling tight, ready to snap. And as the shadow drew closer, Thomas felt the final weight of anticipation press against him. The climax was coming, and nothing in his experience, his observations, or his careful attention could yet tell him what form it would take. The figure in the fog shifted with unnerving precision, neither hurrying nor hesitating, moving as if guided by an internal knowledge that defied logic. Thomas felt a chill crawl up his spine, his heart hammering in his chest. Every instinct screamed that the presence was more than human. Yet there was something faintly familiar in the way it moved, something deliberate, almost methodical, that suggested intelligence behind the stalking shadow. The alley seemed to stretch, the fog folding around them like a living, suffocating veil. Clara pressed closer to him, her hand brushing his arm again, a silent reassurance. Neither spoke, yet their awareness communicated everything. They had learned to read the city together, to note the subtle distortions of shadows, the unnatural pauses in sound, and the faint echoes that seemed to respond to movement as if testing reactions. And now, all those skills would be needed more than ever. Thomas's mind raced through possibilities. The presence could be someone who had learned their routines, someone who understood the rhythms of the fog and the city. Or perhaps it was something older, something that had existed in these streets long before their arrival, feeding on observation, on fear, on the small details that most overlooked. Either way, the test had escalated. Every shadow, every alleyway, every faint whisper carried new weight. The figure paused at the far end of the alley, framed by the dim glow of a single lamp. It remained indistinct, shrouded by fog, yet Thomas could sense the intention. He remembered the note under his door. "You're noticing too much. Be careful where you step." The warning had been real. It had been deliberate. And now, the presence was responding to their awareness, moving in direct correlation with their observation, almost as if it were analyzing them, measuring their attention, calculating their fear. Clara's voice broke the tense silence, soft but deliberate. "Do you see it?" Thomas nodded slowly. "Yes, and it's aware of us." They began to move cautiously, their steps timed to avoid shadows, avoiding the direct line of sight of the figure, yet aware that their every move might be anticipated. The fog curled around the corners, hiding details, distorting shapes. Thomas had learned to interpret these distortions, but even he felt uncertainty gnaw at him. The figure seemed to anticipate their choices before they made them, moving in ways that suggested an understanding of both human instinct and the city's hidden rhythms. At one point, a cat darted across the alley, its shadow briefly merging with the figure. Thomas froze, realizing how easy it would be to mistake ordinary events for deliberate signals. The fog and the darkness created a stage on which every movement seemed loaded with meaning. He glanced at Clara, who held her ground, alert, her gaze fixed on the shadow. The tension between anticipation and uncertainty pressed down on them both. Then came a sound, a faint metallic scrape, followed by the softest whisper, almost imperceptible. Thomas's pulse jumped. The presence was communicating, or perhaps taunting. He could not tell. It was testing boundaries, probing reactions, ensuring that every sense was stretched to the limit. Clara mirrored his movements, subtle shifts in posture, quiet steps, her own senses finely tuned. The city had become a silent partner in the confrontation, its fog, shadows, and echoing alleys part of the escalating tension. Thomas realized that every misstep now could have consequences beyond immediate fear. The presence had been patient for weeks, observing routines, mapping patterns, cataloging weaknesses. And in that moment, Thomas understood that the culmination of those observations was near. The tension was no longer theoretical. It was physical, pressing against him in the cold air, twisting around his mind, bending perception in ways that left no room for error. He tried to anticipate the figure's movements, tracing potential paths, predicting timing, yet every calculation seemed incomplete. The fog shifted unexpectedly, walls narrowed in perception, and the shadow seemed to divide and reform in ways that defied logic. Thomas felt his senses stretch to the breaking point. The city itself had become a living test, a labyrinth in which every observation mattered. Every miscalculation could be fatal. Clara spoke again, quietly, almost a whisper. "It wants us to make the first mistake. It's testing patience, endurance, observation. We can't falter." Thomas nodded, feeling the weight of her words. The presence was deliberate, precise, and the culmination of its observation was imminent. He noticed subtle details. A distant footstep mirrored their own, a shadow that seemed to stretch unnaturally, a faint reflection in a puddle that did not match the known shapes. Every anomaly added to the suspense, each one signaling that the climax was approaching, that the confrontation they had both anticipated was no longer avoidable. They reached a small clearing, with a fog thinned just enough to reveal the surrounding buildings, dark and silent. The figure stepped closer, its form still indistinct, yet every movement deliberate, every pause calculated. Thomas felt a wave of adrenaline and fear surge through him, recognizing that the culmination of weeks of observation, anticipation, and caution was about to unfold. The presence had tested them, guided them, and now it would act. The tension became almost unbearable. Thomas and Clara moved carefully, their senses heightened to the maximum. Every alley, every shadow, every whisper of movement felt loaded with potential danger. The figure continued its slow approach, patient, deliberate, testing reactions, analyzing posture, measuring fear. The city itself seemed to hold its breath, fog curling into patterns that amplified the suspense, streets stretching impossibly as if to prolong the encounter. Thomas's mind raced, cataloging every detail, comparing it to patterns he had observed in the warehouse, the streets, the fog, and even within the behavior of Halbert and Felix. Every variable was now part of a single equation, yet the outcome remained unknowable. The presence was patient, and patience, he realized, was the most dangerous weapon. It could strike at the exact moment when he, Clara, or the environment faltered. A sudden sound drew his attention, a faint scraping from the far end of the alley, followed by a whisper that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. Thomas froze, heart hammering. Clara mirrored his tension, both of them aware that the climax they had been approaching was imminent. The presence was no longer merely observed. It was actively shaping events, controlling perception, manipulating the fog, the shadows, and the spaces around them to heighten the suspense. They had reached the point of no return. Every detail they had noted, every pattern they had deciphered, every observation they had made led to this moment. Thomas felt the weight of anticipation press against him, the culmination of tension stretching every nerve, every sense. He knew instinctively that the next movement, the next decision, would determine the immediate course of the encounter. The figure shifted again, closer, deliberate, patient, every motion measured to test response, endurance, and awareness. The city seemed to contract around them, alleys narrowing, shadows deepening, fog thickening, as if the environment itself was participating in the suspense. Thomas and Clara's combined awareness was pushed to the limit, every subtle movement and observation critical. Thomas took a steadying breath, feeling the pressure of anticipation peak. The weeks of observation, the notes, the patterns, the warnings, and the subtle tests of the fog and shadows had all led to this moment. The presence was near, deliberate, intelligent, and patient. The climax was approaching, yet the resolution remained just out of reach. Every second stretched into eternity. Every shadow seemed alive, and the tension, unbearable and exquisite, left Thomas and Clara poised on the precipice of revelation, awaiting the moment when the final encounter would begin. And then, as the fog curled thicker around the alley, the figure paused once more, its intent undeniable, its presence pressing in from all sides. Thomas and Clara exchanged a glance, silent acknowledgement of the danger and anticipation they shared. The city had been a teacher, a trap, and a stage, and now it had drawn them to the edge. The climax was imminent, the culmination of observation, patience, and suspense. Every heartbeat, every shadow, every whisper held meaning. They stood together, poised, tense, and fully aware that the next movement, from them or from the figure, would ignite the climax that weeks of observation had been building toward. The city held its breath, fog shifting, shadows stretching, the unseen presence waiting, patient, deliberate, and on the verge of acting. Thomas felt the fog press tighter around him. Each breath labored, as if the city itself weighed on his chest. He had expected confrontation, anticipated the figure's next move, but what came next was something entirely different. From the corner of his eye, movement flickered, subtle but undeniable. Another figure emerged from the mist, entirely unexpected, a presence that neither he nor Clara had counted on. Clara tensed beside him. "There's someone else," she whispered, her voice almost swallowed by the fog. Her eyes scanned the street, searching for shape and shadow, but the alley seemed to shift beneath their feet, corners stretching unnaturally, light refracting off damp cobblestones. Thomas realized instantly that the city had become even more unpredictable. Patterns they had mapped, shadows they had tracked, were now complicated by a new variable, a second player in a game they thought they understood. The new figure moved with a purpose that mirrored the first, yet its energy was different, more erratic, less patient. Thomas felt his pulse spike. He hadn't anticipated another presence. This twist altered everything. Their previous observations, their careful routines, their theories about patience, testing, and calculated stalking. Now, there were two unknowns, each with motives and intentions that remained hidden in the fog. "Do you think it's connected to the first one?" Thomas asked, his voice low, almost trembling with the tension that wrapped around them like a living thing. Clara shook her head slowly. "I don't know, but it's deliberate. Both of them are watching, and now they may be working against us, or against each other." She paused, her gaze fixed on the shadows. Or maybe both. Thomas felt a shiver run down his spine. The stakes had escalated beyond what he had imagined. The first presence had been a puzzle of observation, testing patience, manipulating perception. But this second presence introduced chaos. It challenged every assumption Thomas had made, every pattern he had deciphered, every measure of control he thought he had over the fog-draped streets. The city was no longer a predictable stage. It was a labyrinth with multiple forces, each influencing reality in ways they could not yet comprehend. The first figure shifted, responding almost immediately to the appearance of the second. Thomas noticed subtle changes in movement. A pause here, a step there, the way shadows stretched differently along walls and cobblestones. The two presences were aware of each other, and in some way, aware of Thomas and Clara as well. The interplay suggested intelligence, strategy, and deliberate escalation. It was no longer merely a test of endurance or observation. It was now a high-stakes game of perception and survival, played by unknown forces in the fog-choked streets of London. Clara moved closer to Thomas, her hand gripping his arm briefly. "We need to rethink our approach," she whispered. "The patterns we relied on, they're no longer enough. They're adapting. We're being drawn in deeper, and now there's more than one player." Thomas nodded, feeling a tension that pressed on every nerve. The fog seemed thicker than ever, curling into shapes that hinted at movement just beyond their perception. Every creak of timber, every echoing footstep felt charged with meaning. He realized that the second figure introduced unpredictability, a variable that could alter the outcome at any moment. The suspense, already unbearable, had deepened into something more perilous. The two presences moved with subtle coordination, almost imperceptible to untrained eyes. Thomas could feel their awareness pressing against him, testing reactions, evaluating endurance. It was as if the city itself had conspired to draw them into a web of observation, forcing them to adapt or falter. Every decision mattered. A step too fast, a glance too sharp, a misinterpretation of shadows could trigger consequences beyond immediate fear. Then came another surprise. A sound from above, a faint tapping on the rooftops, echoed through the alley. Both Thomas and Clara froze. It was too measured to be random, too deliberate to ignore. The fog distorted it, making it impossible to pinpoint, yet the timing aligned with the movement of the two figures below. The city was layering its tests, compounding observation with sound, shadow, and unseen motion. Thomas's mind raced, cataloging possibilities. Were the figures communicating, or were they responding independently to some larger, unseen pattern? Every instinct screamed that the answer mattered, that each revelation could shift the outcome of whatever confrontation loomed ahead. The second figure took a sudden step forward, breaking the tenuous rhythm. Its movement caused the first figure to respond, and the interplay became visible even through the fog, a dance of strategy, anticipation, and subtle threats. Thomas and Clara were caught in the middle, their senses stretched to the limit, the tension now almost unbearable. Every shadow, every sound, every irregularity became a clue or a trap. Clara's voice broke through the growing pressure. "We can't wait any longer. They're testing us, but now it's escalation. We have to act, or we'll be trapped in their web." Thomas nodded, realizing that the escalation demanded not only observation but courage, decisiveness, and trust in each other. They had been watching, learning, and mapping, but the presence, now doubled, had shifted the rules. The climax was no longer approaching linearly. It was being pulled forward, accelerated by unpredictability and layered tension. As the two figures moved closer, Thomas noticed subtle cues, the way shadows warped, the way fog gathered and thinned, even the faint patterns of sound in the alley. Every detail seemed intentional, every irregularity a message or a test. The second figure had forced them into a position where hesitation could be fatal and awareness alone might not be enough. The alley itself seemed to conspire, walls narrowing, fog curling, shadows stretching, as if the city were participating in the escalation. Thomas could feel the pressure building, each heartbeat louder than the last, each breath shallow and tense. He glanced at Clara, whose eyes reflected the same mixture of fear, determination, and anticipation. The escalation was real, deliberate, and it left no room for error. Then, in an instant, a subtle shift in the fog revealed something Thomas hadn't anticipated. A hidden doorway, half obscured, leading to a space behind the alley. He hadn't noticed it before, and neither had Clara. The doorway seemed to pulse with possibility and danger. The two figures, one patient, deliberate, the other erratic and unpredictable, both turned toward it, almost simultaneously. Thomas realized the implications immediately. The presence they had been observing, the patterns they had been tracking, the tension they had felt for weeks, it was all converging on this hidden space. The fog, the shadows, the city's labyrinthine streets, they had been guiding them toward a single point. And now, with the second figure introduced, the climax of their ordeal was drawing closer, complicated by the unpredictable element of the new arrival. Clara's whisper cut through the tension. "This isn't just observation anymore. They're leading us somewhere. We have to decide, follow, hide, or prepare." Thomas swallowed hard. The stakes had never been higher. The twist of the second presence had escalated everything. The suspense, the danger, the complexity of the conflict. The alley, the fog, the shadows, the layered movements of the two figures. They were all a part of a larger pattern he could not yet fully decipher. The climax was imminent, and the city had orchestrated every step to bring them to this point. Thomas and Clara exchanged a glance, understanding that whatever came next would test not only their observation skills, but their courage, their trust, and their ability to interpret a city that seemed almost alive. The fog thickened, the alley seemed to contract, and the two figures moved with deliberate precision toward the hidden doorway. Every detail, every shadow, every sound now carried the weight of revelation, and the suspense, already unbearable, intensified to a nearly tangible force. They had reached the edge of anticipation. The second plot twist had thrown the balance into chaos, forcing them to adapt, heightening the suspense, and drawing all the threads, fog, shadows, presences, and human perception, toward a moment of confrontation that would change everything. Thomas realized that the climax was no longer a distant horizon. It was unfolding now, every second charged with tension, every movement fraught with uncertainty, and every shadow potentially hiding the truth they had been chasing for weeks. And as the two figures paused at the doorway, the fog swirling around them like a living wall, Thomas knew one thing with terrifying clarity. The stakes had never been higher, the city had never been more alive, and the next moment, whatever it might bring, would push them all to the edge. Thomas and Clara froze, their breath shallow, each inhale sharp and deliberate, as if the fog itself might betray them. The hidden doorway loomed ahead, half obscured by shadows, its edges curling into darkness like an open maw. The two figures they had been tracking now stood at the threshold, one patient, deliberate, the other erratic and unpredictable, both framed by the flickering light of a lone gas lamp. Thomas could feel the weight of anticipation pressing against him, each second stretching into eternity as he tried to anticipate the next move. Clara leaned slightly closer, her hand brushing his arm. "We've been trained to watch," she whispered, "but they've forced us into a different rhythm now. This isn't just observation. It's reaction, improvisation, survival." Her words carried the sharp edge of urgency, but also a calm determination that Thomas drew strength from. They had been learning the patterns of the city, the subtle manipulations of the fog and the shadows, but the addition of a second presence had rewritten the rules entirely. The first figure stepped forward, deliberate, every movement controlled and precise. Its shadow stretched unnaturally along the alley walls, elongating and twisting in ways that seemed almost deliberate, a visual echo of its intent. Thomas felt a chill crawl up his spine. He realized the figure's patience was a weapon, a way to manipulate perception, to test endurance, and now, with the second figure in play, the pressure intensified. The unpredictable element introduced chaos, and the careful strategies Thomas and Clara had relied upon were suddenly fragile, easily disrupted. The second figure advanced as well, but its movements were different, jerky, unpredictable, yet calculated in their own way. It darted between patches of fog, disappearing and reappearing, forcing Thomas to constantly adjust his focus. Every shadow it crossed seemed to pulse with tension, the fog twisting as if reacting to its presence. Thomas knew instinctively that it wasn't random. This figure was testing not only their awareness, but also their ability to adapt, to respond under pressure, to navigate uncertainty. Thomas swallowed hard, scanning the alley, the doorway, the fog. Every detail mattered. He had memorized patterns, learned rhythms, mapped movements, but now those plans were complicated. The interplay between the two figures created a dynamic he could not fully predict. The city had become an active participant, each shadow, each curling tendril of fog, an instrument in the unfolding tension. A faint tapping echoed from the rooftops above, high and irregular, almost like a warning. Thomas looked up instinctively, noting how the sound seemed to ripple through the alley, altering perception, masking subtle shifts below. The first figure paused briefly, its attention split, as if acknowledging the pattern. The second figure moved with renewed urgency, slipping closer to the doorway while keeping one eye on Thomas and Clara. The layers of suspense thickened with each passing second. Clara's whisper cut through the tension. "They're leading us. They want us to come closer." But closer to what? Her gaze scanned the doorway and the shadows around it. "We've been observers for weeks, but now we're participants. And if we misstep..." Her voice trailed off, leaving the implication hanging in the dense fog. Thomas nodded, feeling a cold weight settle over him. The presence, now doubled, had been orchestrating events with subtlety and patience, but the escalation meant the climax was unfolding faster than he had anticipated. Every instinct, every ounce of observation, every split-second decision mattered. They could not falter. They could not misinterpret a single shadow, a single sound, a single movement. The doorway suddenly seemed to pulse with significance, the fog curling around it like fingers. Thomas realized that weeks of patterns, of patient observation, of decoding the subtle cues of the city, had led here. The figures' positions, the timing of their movements, the distortions of shadow and light. It all converged on this single point. And the addition of a second presence had turned a test of patience into a high-stakes labyrinth, each turn fraught with danger. Then came an unexpected shift. A third shadow appeared, smaller, faster, moving along the edge of the alley. Neither Thomas nor Clara had seen it approach. Its movements were deliberate but subtle, blending almost seamlessly with the fog, yet it carried a sense of purpose, an intent that Thomas felt instantly. The presence of this third figure changed the dynamic entirely. The first two presences reacted, their movements becoming more deliberate, more focused, almost as if the newcomer had disrupted a delicate balance they had been maintaining. Clara's eyes widened. "Another one," she whispered, disbelief mixed with tension. "We've underestimated them, underestimated it." Thomas realized she was right. They had been tracking two presences, working to understand patterns, waiting for a confrontation they thought they could anticipate. But the third figure introduced unpredictability, a variable that neither observation nor intuition could fully account for. The stakes had risen dramatically. Every step, every breath, every glance now carried heightened risk. The first figure moved closer to the doorway, deliberate and unhurried, while the second figure darted between fog and shadow, unpredictable yet calculated. The third figure lingered at the edge of visibility, silent, observing, its presence an unknown quantity. Thomas felt a surge of adrenaline and fear. The city itself seemed to tense with them, walls narrowing, shadows stretching, the fog thickening as if it too were aware of the escalation. Clara's voice was low but firm. "They're testing our limits. And now, with the third one, the rules have changed. We can't just react. We have to anticipate, or we'll be trapped." Thomas nodded, the weight of her words sinking in. Weeks of observation, analysis, and preparation had led to this tense moment, yet the escalation threatened to undo everything. The fog, the shadows, the presences, they were all part of a network of tension and anticipation, a web that Thomas and Clara were forced to navigate without full understanding of the stakes or the outcome. The first figure reached the doorway and paused, its shadow stretching across the threshold like a warning. The second figure mirrored the movement, advancing in a different rhythm, testing reactions. The third figure shifted subtly, drawing patterns in the fog, unseen but felt. Thomas and Clara could sense the culmination approaching, the convergence of all these elements toward a single, inevitable point of confrontation. Thomas's heart pounded as he realized the full scope of the escalation. The presence they had been observing for weeks had multiplied, each figure introducing unique tension, unpredictability, and challenge. The city itself had become an active participant in the climax, using fog, shadow, sound, and timing to manipulate perception and heighten suspense. Every decision mattered, every movement carried weight, and the potential consequences loomed large. A sudden, sharp movement from the first figure drew Thomas's attention. A subtle gesture, almost imperceptible, yet charged with intent. The second figure responded instantly, and the third figure moved in a pattern that Thomas could barely process. The interplay of observation, calculation, and manipulation had reached a fever pitch. The tension was unbearable, yet electrifying, the anticipation stretching every sense to its limit. Clara's hand found his arm again, grounding him. "We have to be ready. They're not just testing us, they're escalating to action. Whatever happens next will change everything." Thomas swallowed hard, feeling the weight of her words. The climax, already near, had been intensified by the second and now third presence. The alley, the fog, the shadows, the hidden doorway, all were components in a carefully orchestrated escalation designed to challenge, test, and manipulate. The suspense was at its peak, every heartbeat a reminder that the confrontation could erupt at any moment, and that the next second might bring revelation, danger, or both. He focused, cataloging every detail, mapping every shadow, listening to every sound. The fog swirled around them, curling into forms that seemed almost sentient. The first figure shifted slightly, the second darted between shadows, and the third lingered, unseen but sensed. Thomas and Clara were poised on the edge of revelation, the culmination of weeks of tension, observation, and escalating conflict drawing them forward into the unknown. The city held its breath with them. The fog thickened, shadows deepened, and the presences moved in a deliberate, synchronized tension that left no room for hesitation. Thomas understood with chilling clarity that the escalation, the second plot twist, the introduction of the third presence, had pushed them to the brink. The climax was imminent, and the city itself seemed to conspire to ensure that when it arrived, there would be no turning back. Every muscle in Thomas's body tensed, every instinct sharpened, every shadow, every movement, every echo of the fog became part of a complex, high-stakes puzzle he had been navigating for weeks. And now, with the escalation complete, the figures poised, and the hidden doorway looming, the final moments before confrontation were upon them. Thomas and Clara exchanged a glance, silent acknowledgement of fear, determination, and shared purpose. The stakes had never been higher. The suspense had never been more acute. And as the fog swirled, the shadows stretched, and the presences advanced, Thomas felt the edge of revelation press closer than ever, ready to tip the scales into the climax that would test everything they had observed, everything they had learned, and everything they could endure. The fog parted suddenly, almost violently, as if the alley itself exhaled, revealing the doorway fully for the first time. Thomas's heart pounded, each beat echoing in the narrow space. The three figures, the patient one, the unpredictable one, and the unseen third, stood in tense formation. Every shadow seemed alive, twisting around them, every whisper of movement amplified by the city's darkened streets. Thomas and Clara knew, instinctively, that the climax had arrived. The patient figure stepped forward first, its movements deliberate and precise. It halted at the doorway, and Thomas noticed for the first time the faint glimmer of recognition in its posture, a familiar pattern of observation, almost human in its familiarity. Then the unpredictable figure darted around, circling the doorway, testing, probing, its energy chaotic yet controlled. The tension between the two presences was palpable, and the alley seemed to shrink around them, pressing in like a living thing. Thomas took a steadying breath. "Clara, we have to confront them. We can't be guided anymore. We have to act." She nodded, her own resolve mirrored in his eyes. Together, she whispered. They moved forward slowly, each step measured, every sense alert. The first figure's shadow stretched along the doorway. The second flickered in the fog like a sudden gust of wind, and the third figure emerged fully from mist. Thomas's breath caught. It was not a stranger. The third presence was someone they had both known all along, a figure who had been guiding clues, testing patterns, and subtly manipulating events behind the scenes. The city had been a stage for a hidden hand, orchestrating tension and anticipation with perfect timing. The revelation hit Thomas and Clara simultaneously. Weeks of observation, the intricate mapping of shadows and fog, the careful avoidance of traps. They had been participants in a game designed not just to test them, but to prepare them for this exact confrontation. The twist was undeniable. The third figure was the architect, the true controller of the escalating suspense. The first figure stepped aside, revealing the doorway fully. "You've observed, you've endured, and now the final choice is yours," a voice said, calm and measured, echoing faintly in the fog. Thomas's pulse surged. The voice was familiar, but blurred with the weight of authority and mystery. The second figure, unpredictable and chaotic, moved closer to them, eyes flicking between Thomas, Clara, and the doorway. It spoke, its tone urgent yet edged with warning. "You cannot hesitate. The patterns have brought you here for a reason. Everything you've learned, every observation, it matters now." Thomas and Clara exchanged a glance, understanding immediately. The city's fog, the shadows, the hidden doorway, the three presences, they had all been preparing them for a critical decision. The climax wasn't merely about facing the figures. It was about deciphering the truth they had been circling for weeks. Thomas stepped forward, hand brushing against Clara's for reassurance. "We know why we're here," he said, voice steady despite the tension. "And we're ready." The figures shifted subtly, almost imperceptibly, acknowledging their declaration. Then, as one, they stepped aside, revealing a small, dimly lit chamber beyond the doorway. The walls were lined with notes, sketches, and patterns Thomas and Clara had studied but never fully understood. It was a culmination of observation, hidden connections, and the careful manipulation of the city's environment. Clara gasped softly. "It's all here, every clue, every test. The fog, the shadows, it was leading us to this." The third figure emerged fully now, stepping into the chamber. "Yes," the voice said, calm but commanding. "Every pattern, every observation, every moment of tension, it was all designed to bring clarity. You were being prepared for understanding, for recognition of the hidden forces shaping your reality." Thomas felt a mixture of relief and awe. The suspense, the fear, the relentless observation, it had all been purposeful. Yet, even as the tension eased, the city's presence still lingered, a reminder that control was never complete, that awareness was only part of the equation. Suddenly, the chamber's faint light shifted, casting shadows in ways that made Thomas instinctively step back. The third figure's eyes narrowed. Not everything is as it seems. Awareness alone cannot reveal the final truth. Then came the final twist. A subtle sound, almost imperceptible, reverberated through the walls. A second doorway, hidden entirely behind a wall of sketches, revealed by a faint shift in the light. Thomas's breath caught. The first three figures had guided them here, but the city still held one more secret, one final test. Clara's eyes widened. "Another one?" Thomas nodded slowly, realization dawning. "We've reached the climax, but the story isn't over. The city, the fog, the shadows, they're still in control. This is another layer, another challenge we didn't anticipate." The three presences exchanged subtle glances, their expressions unreadable. Then the patient figure gestured toward the newly revealed doorway. "You see the final layer now. Your understanding is necessary, but the next step requires courage, discernment, and trust. The truth awaits beyond that door, but is not guaranteed to be what you expect." Thomas felt adrenaline surge. Every step, every observation, every decision had led to this moment, yet the suspense remained as taut as ever. The climax had resolved the immediate conflict. They understood the manipulations, they had confronted the presences, and they had discovered the architect behind the tests. But the final twist reminded them that even resolution carried uncertainty, and even revelation demanded caution. Clara took a deep breath, her hand finding Thomas's once more. "Together," she said, resolute. Thomas nodded, feeling a renewed sense of determination. "Together," he echoed. As they stepped toward the hidden doorway, the fog outside the chamber seemed to pulse with anticipation, the shadows bending and twisting as if aware of their choice. The three figures remained behind, silent, observing, patient once more. The city had orchestrated suspense, guided perception, and layered tension to this point, and even now, the final revelation hung just beyond reach, promising both insight and danger. Thomas's mind cataloged everything. The weeks of observation, the escalating conflicts, the unpredictable movements of the presences, the revelation of the hidden architect. And yet, despite understanding so much, he realized the ultimate truth was still uncertain. The suspense, the layers of mystery, and the manipulation of the city had not ended. They had only reached the next stage. With a final glance at Clara, Thomas stepped forward, the chamber's light brushing their faces. The fog outside the doorway seemed apart, shadows bending, anticipation vibrating through every stone of the alley. They were ready to face the next revelation, to uncover the hidden layer the city had prepared, yet the twist remained. Even when you think the climax has arrived, the city, the shadows, and the fog could still hold surprises beyond comprehension. And as the doorway slowly opened, Thomas felt the tension tighten once more, the suspense stretching to its limits. The climax had resolved the immediate conflicts. The figures had revealed their intentions, but the city and the hidden truths it guarded still waited, patient and deliberate, for the next step. The story had reached a resolution. Yet in the final twist, Thomas and Clara understood that every ending in this city was merely a doorway to the next layer of mystery. Thomas and Clara stepped through the hidden doorway together, the fog and shadows falling away like a curtain revealing a final act. Inside, the space was small, dimly lit, but orderly, lined with notes, sketches, and maps that connected every alley, every movement, every whisper of fog they had encountered. It was a repository of observation, a record of the city's subtle manipulations, and, most importantly, a reflection of the intelligence guiding it. Thomas ran his hand lightly along a row of sketches, realizing how much the city itself had been a teacher, a labyrinth designed not to harm, but to sharpen perception and attention to detail. Clara moved beside him, scanning the room with careful eyes. "All of this, it's like someone wanted us to see everything at once," she murmured. "Every shadow, every pattern, every moment of suspense. They were training us, preparing us for something bigger." Thomas nodded. The three presences, they weren't just threats. They were instruments of understanding. In the city, the fog, the alleys, they were all part of the lesson. He paused, tracing the lines of one particularly detailed map, showing the interplay of light, shadow, and movement. "We thought we were just surviving, but really, we were learning. The escalation, the surprises, it wasn't chaos. It was design." The third figure, the architect behind the weeks of tension, stepped forward into the chamber. Their face was familiar now, lined with experience, a quiet authority in their posture. "You've observed, endured, and adapted. That was always the purpose," they said softly. "The city has its rhythms, its patterns, and only those who pay attention, who notice the details, can understand it fully. You've done that." Thomas and Clara exchanged a glance. Relief, mixed with awe, settled over them. The fear and suspense that had gripped them for weeks began to ease, replaced by understanding. The city had tested them, escalated the stakes, introduced unpredictability, but ultimately, it had been about teaching perception, resilience, and the value of attention. "But why all the layers?" Clara asked, still cautious. "Why the multiple figures, the fog, the shadows? It felt like we were always just one step away from danger." The architect smiled faintly. "Because understanding comes in layers. Observation alone is not enough. Patience, endurance, adaptation, and courage, they all matter. The surprises, the twists, the escalation, they were tools to reveal your capacity to notice, to think, and to respond. Life, like the city, is rarely straightforward. The lessons must come through experience." Thomas let the words sink in. He realized that the escalating suspense, the dual presences, and the final hidden doorway had all served a single purpose: to test limits, to challenge assumptions, to push them both beyond comfort and fear into insight. The city, once merely a backdrop, had become an active participant, a living tutor that had guided them through tension into clarity. Clara reached for a particularly large sketch, showing a pattern of alleyways, lamplight, and fog swirling almost like a map of human perception itself. "It's beautiful and terrifying," she whispered. "We were part of a story we couldn't see, playing roles we didn't know existed." Thomas nodded. "And now we can see it. That's the gift and the lesson. Awareness isn't just survival. It's understanding the rhythms around us, noticing the small details that make all the difference." The architect stepped aside, gesturing toward the doorway, leading back to the alley outside. "You've completed this part of the journey. The city will continue its work, but you are no longer passive. You can navigate its patterns, recognize its cues, and move with purpose rather than reaction." As Thomas and Clara left the chamber, the fog outside seemed thinner, the shadows less menacing. The city that had once felt like a maze of suspense and threat now appeared as a landscape of subtle patterns and hidden truths. They moved together, side by side, feeling a sense of calm tempered by the awareness that life and the city would always contain uncertainty, unpredictability, and layers of meaning waiting to be discovered. On the street, Halbert and Felix emerged from the fog, expressions a mix of relief and curiosity. Thomas approached them slowly. "It's over," he said, "or at least the part we can understand. We've seen the patterns, discovered the architect, and learned how to read the city differently." Felix nodded. "It wasn't easy. I thought the fog, the shadows, the figures, they were just danger. Turns out they were part of the teaching." Halbert added, "And the escalation? That second figure, the third figure, I never would have predicted that. The tension, it was incredible. But now it makes sense. The city itself has lessons to teach." Thomas looked back once more toward the alleyways, toward the hidden doorway that had revealed the final layer of mystery. The fog swirled gently in the lamplight, no longer threatening, only whispering possibilities. The city had shown them fear, suspense, and unpredictability, but also clarity, insight, and resilience. Clara took a deep breath, the tension leaving her shoulders. "We'll never look at the city the same way again," she said quietly. "Every shadow, every alley, every whisper of fog will carry meaning now. We've been changed by what we've learned." Thomas smiled faintly. "And that's the lesson, isn't it? Awareness, patience, and attention. It's not just about surviving the suspense. It's about understanding the world in layers, appreciating the patterns, and knowing that surprises, even the frightening ones, can teach us something important." They walked slowly through the streets, the fog lifting slightly, the city calm yet alive. The experiences, the tension, the escalating conflicts, all had resolved into understanding. The presences, once threatening, had revealed their purpose. The hidden doorway, the layers of observation and manipulation, the climax of suspense, they all concluded with clarity. Yet even as they moved forward, Thomas felt a familiar stir of anticipation. The city was never fully predictable, its fog and shadows never entirely tamed. Even now, a slight movement in a distant alley, a faint echo in the cobblestones, reminded him that awareness was a lifelong skill, patience a constant companion, and observation a tool that could always uncover new mysteries. Clara glanced at him, her expression reflective. "We've finished this chapter," she said, "but the city always has more to teach. And next time, we'll be ready to see it." Thomas nodded, feeling the weight and gift of the experience settle within him. They had faced escalating suspense, unexpected twists, and layered conflicts, and emerged with understanding and insight. The city had tested them, challenged them, and taught them in ways they could never have anticipated, leaving them wiser and more aware. As they disappeared into the streets, the fog curling gently behind them, the city seemed to exhale. Shadows fell naturally, light refracted calmly, and the alleys that had once seemed alive with suspense now rested in quiet balance. The lessons remained: patience, observation, and the courage to navigate uncertainty were the true keys to understanding. Even with the final twists revealed and conflicts resolved, the city remained alive with hidden layers. Each corner, each shadow, each whisper of fog, a reminder that life was composed of patterns waiting to be noticed. Thomas and Clara had learned to read them, to endure suspense, and to navigate escalation. But the world would always offer new mysteries, new lessons, and new challenges. And so, they walked on, aware, alert, and changed forever by what they had experienced. The city, once a maze of fog and shadow, had become a teacher, and they were ready for whatever came next, knowing that awareness and observation would guide them, while patience and courage would allow them to thrive, even in the face of the unexpected. In the quiet aftermath, Thomas reflected on the journey. The escalating suspense, the layers of observation, the unpredictable figures, and the hidden architect had all been part of a single lesson. Understanding the world required more than seeing. It required perceiving, interpreting, and enduring. Every challenge, every twist, every moment of fear had contributed to insight. And in that realization, the story reached its final, satisfying conclusion, leaving both Thomas, Clara, and the audience with a sense of resolution, reflection, and enduring curiosity about the hidden layers in the world around them.